Welcome to Sorghum Smart Talk, a podcast brought to you through a partnership of national sorghum producers and the Sorghum Checkoff. I'm John Duff, coming to you from Lubbock, Texas. Today we're going to focus on marketing again, and specifically cost of production. Accounting, knowing your costs so that you know when you're in profitable territory and can pull the trigger on marketing decisions. This is a topic that's pretty important to me, so I'll get on my soapbox in a second. But first, let's learn a little more about John Miller. John, you went to Texas A&M for your degrees. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
So that was ag economics. I know you had a master's. Did you do a PhD as well?
I did back in the middle 90s, and I worked under a group of professors that operated a policy center, and we studied alternative outcomes to various shocks to the ag system. And it was a very, at the time, very sophisticated programming, and its foundation was basically financial management as well.
So I think the last time we talked, you were going out of town, and I believe the A&M Alabama game was that weekend. Were you in Tuscaloosa for that?
You know, I wasn't. That would have been good. Maybe I could have helped him get through there.
Maybe it would have turned out better.
I'm sorry I missed out on that for him, but I am going to the Kentucky game tomorrow night, so they better look out.
All right. Well,
maybe tears tomorrow night from Kentucky.
I'll be looking for those. So, drag my soapbox out for a second. Cost of production is an extremely important aspect of marketing. I think it may be one of the most underrated, underappreciated, underutilized tools when it comes to marketing. I think that it's really hard to make marketing decisions in a vacuum, and when you don't know where you're profitable, it's really hard to actually pull the trigger on marketing in profitable territory. Went through this cost tracking exercise with my dad, and we know his cost of production on cotton down to the penny now. And so when he knows he's in profitable territory, he pulls the trigger. And this year he did. Has about 40% of his cotton hedged, and it's in profitable territory. So with that, let's kick off. Tell me about your clients and their costs of production. Do they know their cost of production pretty well overall, or do they kind of shoot in the dark on that? How do they go about tracking those?
You know, I would say that's one of the things that's changed a lot, you know, in my 20 years of experience, you know, working with these types of customers. You know, all those years ago, say in the late 90s, I really didn't see a lot of rigid cost analysis. I mean, there were definitely some that did that. But of course, if you remember, it was a lot less expensive per acre to grow crops. There was a lot of self-financing. And so sort of year-end book balancing and normal tax accounting and the loan renewal process, I think gave most people a pretty good snapshot of where they were. And there's still some operations, I think, that kind of operate that way. You know, they balance the books when the crop's all in and sold, and do their tax returns maybe with an accountant, you know, early in the following year, and then do their loan renewal. And if all that runs smoothly, I think a lot of them maybe don't see the need to dig a whole lot deeper, you know, into the financial analysis. But I think with the advent of, go ahead.
What are they using, those platforms, for those growers that have moved to that level of analysis and they're not relying on the loan process to kind of balance the books? What are they using? QuickBooks, or do they do spreadsheets, or what are some of your clients using to track costs?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, like most small business, maybe even medium to large size businesses, that, you know, QuickBooks or its competitors are very popular, you know, as far as balancing the checkbook and making payroll and doing those sorts of things. And then you have, you know, with children that come back from college with a lot of new skills, or maybe, you know, manage their time in a different way. You know, they build custom spreadsheets and maybe analyze various pieces of equipment or certain farms they have in question, or certain strategies on the farm with spreadsheets. But then you're starting to see more, and there always has been these people, but you're starting to see more and more of maybe buying a black box program that someone else has developed. Just to name one, I can think of Red Wing, up in Minnesota, and they've actually bought up a lot of other programs over the last 25, 30 years, and a lot of farmers will use something similar to that to manage finances. And then too, there's so much record keeping on the farm with respect to chemical usage, various labor statistics you need to keep, and a lot of these programs now incorporate kind of a whole farm approach, where you can do a massive amount of analysis. Of course, the drawback to those types of things is that there usually is a fairly steep learning curve, to go from, say, a QuickBooks or, your own spreadsheets, or maybe you hire an outside bookkeeper, to take all your information and do monthly bookkeeping. But to go to a program, say you download off the web, that's again a black box program, and you maybe have to email back and forth for technical support and that types of things, that can be a little more time consuming than a lot of people want. But I do know these programs have gotten more user friendly over the years. Obviously, they've had more and more years to incorporate the more sophistication we see in computer capabilities, just like phone calls like this, or texting back and forth, or chatting with online support. So I see this as a growing market for agriculture. I think another challenge too is that agriculture is a little bit unique in the timing of the revenues and the expenses, kind of the complication on the buying and the selling, and how that doesn't really coordinate with the expenses very well. And so, a single year doesn't mean the same to a farmer as it does to, a manufacturer of a fixed product.
That's a great point there. You talk about a steep learning curve for farmers from a program and software perspective, but sometimes it's just as difficult to deal with concepts like what you're talking about. And you're kind of teasing it there. I'll just go ahead and push in that direction. Cash versus accrual accounting. For our listeners that aren't familiar with the difference between those two, the ups, the downs, the pros and cons of each, and how it relates to marketing decisions, talk a little bit about that, cash versus accrual.
There's a few pluses and minuses for each, and for most small business in reality, and then personal finance management, I think cash accounting has kind of been the standard and probably continue to be so. Large business, particularly large corporations, if you want to use that term, I would say accrual is probably the standard, the most widely used system. And of course, a lot of those companies are paying estimated taxes quarterly and budgeting quarterly, and a little more speedy of a timeline than say, a lot of small business. So whereas a cash accounting, you enter the expense when you write the check, right? And then when you enter the revenue when you receive the check. Whereas in accrual, it becomes a timing issue. When you incur the expense, you enter the expense rather than wait until you write the check. Or when you, say for example, if you sold a piece of equipment in January, but maybe you didn't receive a check for it until February, but you've already entered that as an anticipated revenue. And I guess the big pro or con is just talk about one for time's sake, but under a cash accounting system, I guess you could see how if you waited for your cash to come in, you kind of get money balled up towards the end of the year, right? Particularly those firms like agriculture, or maybe even, say, retail, where they do 90% of their business in December. It's kind of hard to show an accurate picture of the year-round profitability or sustainability of that firm when you're entering all your expenses or revenues, in the final quarter. Whereas accrual, I think, is popular with bigger companies because it smooths those expenses and revenues out throughout the year, and lets you be a little more anticipatory, quarter to quarter, what your margins are. So I think that's probably the biggest And there's some subtleties about the way inventory is handled, and we can get off in the weeds about that. But I think the biggest thing is just the timing. And so I'll stand by the idea that personal finances and small business probably stay with cash just for the simplicity, the straightforward nature of it. But as a business gets bigger, they get encouraged to use accrual. And I would suspect that accountants, for most firms, they're probably doing both, to make various comparisons they need to.
So we talk about farmers and timing of decision making and market timing. And when you call a farmer that has a good handle on his costs and understands that at a given time during the year where he's at, can you tell a difference between those farmers that have a little better idea about where they're at during the year and those farmers that have a little less good idea? Is that pretty obvious to you guys during the year?
It is, because just think about cotton or sorghum this past year. Someone that maybe didn't understand their cost well enough or soon enough, as the cotton market was rallying there in the late summer, or the corn markets back in the late spring, early summer, they reached levels that over the last 4 or 5 years have probably been very comparable, but still at levels that to put money back, you probably need a little bit more, and so the ones that maybe don't have a good handle on their costs for that year yet are definitely more hesitant to pull the trigger. And again, I think part of that is just not knowing how much income is going to be needed. Whereas the person that, say, knew that the cost to grow cotton was X amount an acre, let's just pick 700 an acre or for an irrigated crop, or 800 an acre, or maybe they'd like to relate it back to 75 cents a bushel, or 75 cents a pound, or 80 cents a pound. That person has the freedom. They have the freedom to make a decision knowing they've covered cost, and they have, I guess, less of the look back issue, right? To where if the market goes higher, they look back with regrets. But if they're selling incrementally, they know their cost, they can feel confident that they made a decision based on the best information they had at the time. So I don't know if it's the right description, but I like to think about it the way I see it, in that the person that knows their cost early on in the season, or at least I know costs are a changing dynamic, but at least has on the page and has a good idea of what their range of costs will be. That just frees their mind to make marketing decisions based on that price floor needed to ensure production. And I think most farmers nowadays really do think about sustainability. They're long-term thinkers. Obviously they're already thinking about next year by the middle of one year. And so I just think that if you know your cost, again, you don't have to worry so much about the next decision. If the market goes higher, well, we covered cost, we'll do it again and raise our average. And if it continues to go up, you know what, we can sell next year at a profit. So absolutely, you can sense a real difference based on, I guess, how advanced they are in their understanding of costs.
So I'll take it one step further from a look-back perspective. You have done a great job at really pushing your producers to know this issue better. And you've done hedge schools for several years, and you have FC Stone come in and do a school yearly for your producers. And on the sidelines of some of those, 7 in fact, you've done cost workshops where you bring a group of farmers in and they go through the gory details of a crop budget for an entire day. And I've had the privilege of being involved in 2 of those. And one thing that was very striking to me was a conversation at the last one that I went to where you had a producer that's been a long-term customer of yours, and they really sharpened their pencils with the last few years of lower margins, and they just looked back and realized in $7 corn years they didn't make a whole lot of money. And with their pencil sharper, and they shed a little bit of land, and they sold some assets that weren't performing, and they beefed up in places where they needed to beef up. And even as low as grain prices are for the next couple of years outlook, they're looking forward to actually making money over the next couple of years, and maybe even more money than they made in $7 corn years. And that was one thing that was extremely striking to me from the outcome of that workshop. But tell me about some of your feedback from those cost workshops, where a group of growers sit down and they talk as a peer group and they compare. Tell me what some of your feedback has been, because I love the concept and want to see it pushed out to other parts of the country.
Very positive. In fact, when we started doing those, under various meeting settings, and later on, like just at a hedge school, we might have maybe 5 to 10 farmers that would come a day early, and join the cost discussion. And, they would bring a few notes and random pieces of paper, and there were some exceptions to that. We had some even 15, 20 years ago, they were, very organized, but that was kind of rare at the time. But again, even those fellows back in those days, once you open the discussion, after an hour or so, they really realized they knew more about their costs than they did, and they really caught on to the game. And it's been interesting to see over the years that the size of the audience for that day early cost session has grown. People come back repetitively year after year to be a part of that, and how the now they bring printouts, from either QuickBooks or spreadsheets of their own, or something like Red Wing, for example. And so they're almost over-prepared because they come with so much information. We have to be selective, on what we use and talk about. But the two biggest things of feedback I get is that, one, they know more about themselves. And I guess I'll add a third one. They know more about different farms, because they've graduated into farm-by-farm analysis to help them determine, hey, we're taking this equipment 35 miles down the road.
Is it worth it?
Are we making money down there?
They're treating farms like a factory.
Yeah, exactly. And you're seeing a lot more of that. But then thirdly, and this might be the most that they get out of it personally, is just that what others are doing to track cost and do year-end assessments of cost and pre-plan assessments of cost. And then also just how different regions compare. I can just remember farmers from, say, South Texas, their main motivation for coming is to maybe see how Central Texas or the Panhandle, or maybe, someone from Oklahoma or New Mexico, how are they using cost to grow or change their operation. So, you can't do anything in a vacuum. You can try to know as much as you can about yourself, but I think that just like our risk management service on the financial management side, the people that are coming, the farmers that are out there now, and I think even ones that have learned to adapt to computer technology, they want this to be one of the areas where they're just better at what they're doing, and so the computer technology, the plethora of information, whether it be out of universities or private consulting like we are, what have you, it's out there, it's available, and not that high of a cost.
So You talked about one thing I want to draw out a little more on and discuss a little more. You talked about regionality and the difference between growers up on the plains and maybe south. What differences do you see? Are there big differences regionally, or is it a crop by crop difference, or do you see those areas that are really tough production environments the farmers are by and large less sophisticated, or are they more sophisticated because their pencils have to be sharper? Or is it even really possible to classify those by regions?
No, there are differences, and if you want to just stick with Texas for now, and we'll say South Texas, and we'll have kind of upper coast, central Texas, a lot of commonality in weather and cropping patterns, and of course where you are in the Texas Panhandle. In South Texas, you have what I guess I would call nowadays very, very large dryland farms. Large equipment, a lot of production risk. A big focus on cost control. So if we just assume average rainfall, for the year we're looking at here, they can really learn to control cost and make a difference to get those costs down. And so I would say in certain crops, we'll use cotton for example, that they would probably be very competitive in their cost of production. Whereas you get up in the upper coast, central Texas on cotton for example, they oftentimes won't get a long string of warm weather or the right heat units or dry periods that'll let the crop develop the way it needs to, and it will greatly increase their costs. Not just by cutting yield, but just increasing their cost in general. Maybe more insect pressure, things like that. More passes on the crop. And then of course you get into West Texas, you get into the entire irrigation dynamic. The water's deeper than say where I am here in the Brazos Valley, so higher irrigation costs for those farmers, and then of course the high production risk on the dryland. But now I would say the large dryland farms in the Panhandle, maybe the cold temperatures are their defoliant, and savings costs like that, maybe less insect pressure, that with the right amount of rainfall, they would be very competitive to the South Texan. So, yeah, depending on the climate, the amount of rainfall and when that rainfall occurs, it can have a big effect on costs. And so what you get into is you start creating scenarios, and you say, well, in South Texas, cost of production could run on, say this, we just stay with cotton, it could be as high as 80 cents under certain yield conditions and weather, but it could be as low as 65 cents under a different condition. And so you go throughout the year monitoring that and trying to narrow that gap throughout the marketing season. So it's not something you just talk about at the conference in January.
Absolutely.
Talk about multiple times a year. Central Texas, upper coast, just like this year, we've had roughly half the cotton crop still out there that should have been harvested 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks ago. And that's taking yield down and running costs up, trying to work in the muddy conditions, whatever. Get more harvesting equipment in to speed things up when you can go, those types of things. And then West Texas, I guess I'll pick on last year with the low max situation in cotton that wasn't expected. So there's just things that are out of their control that can make it hard to narrow down that cost of production. But absolutely, we see different cost of production across different regions. But now, in saying that, that plays very well into our individualized marketing plan and risk management scheme, because when cotton futures get to 75 or 80 cents or 85 cents, or sorghum prices get to $6 or $7 or $7.50 per hundred, and I know you like to talk probably in bushels there in the Panhandle, John, but
our Kansas listeners as well. We're going to be furiously scrambling to calculate that.
Yeah, right. Or if you say, $3.75 or $4 a bushel on sorghum.
Perfect.
Those numbers mean very different things to different people. Someone in a large land area farm in the coastal bend might be very active in the 75 to 80 cent range on cotton, or the $3.75 to $4 range on milo. based on setting floors above cost, whereas someone, maybe choose Waco or Seguin or somewhere, along Central Texas corridor, they may feel like they need to buy puts and test for higher cash markets, knowing that they're not yet covering their costs. And again, those are just loose examples that, we could cherry pick. That's not a generalization between, Central Texas, South Texas, but across our customer base, those are the types of discussions that we have.
So let's drill down a little bit to wrap up here. Difference between variable costs and overhead costs. You talked about irrigation a second ago, and that one obviously will be radically different across regions and across years and across weather patterns and crops. Talk a little bit about how your customers look at covering variable versus those overhead costs, or do they worry about that?
No, they do. I mean, I guess as we're taught in college, the difference between variable cost versus more the fixed cost. The business, I guess your first order of business is covering those variable costs, and you tend to amortize a lot of those fixed costs. But the fixed costs have to be paid too, right? Month in, month out. Yeah. So we encourage them to look at both and come up with the total cost. I think, while you need to know you're out of pocket, obviously, and I think most farmers could probably rattle that off the top of their heads, sitting in the pickup, their outlays, to get the crop in, and, for example. But that can kind of be a trap, a little bit, where you say, well, it cost me, I can put a corn crop in for $275 or a milo crop in for, $195, and then overlook the fact of these equipment payments, land payments and different things.
At the end of the day, somebody still has to pay for those things.
Right. So we like to look at a whole farm situation, and we like to look at we also like to look at total cost. And so when we do our cost analysis with farmers, we have a spreadsheet developed once you've been a part of that. And we obviously really number crunch the variable cost and get that down, and then start looking at fixed cost. In fact, we'll take those fixed costs. There are certain fixed costs, maybe a particular piece of equipment tied to only the one crop, that we can assign that to a crop. And so we'll have a sort of an allocated fixed cost that we can charge to a particular crop, and then an unallocated fixed cost that just gets spread out across the entire farm, right? And so I think that was an eye-opener for a lot of farmers too, because if they don't understand what their fixed costs are covering or how they're covering various crops, you'll really never come up with a true break-even, right? And a tractor, for example, it's probably going to get a little more of a workout on cotton than it is on sorghum, or for sure for corn, and for sure for wheat. So how do you charge, a tractor, say on the same acres of each crop, a fourth of it to each one? I mean, that just doesn't work. And so what we've learned to do, and I think it's the most accurate way, is to look at each crop's representation across variable cost, and then take those percentages and apply to fixed cost, to where you have some sense of a charge of fixed cost for each commodity.
In other words, if variable costs are taken up 65% by sorghum, then sorghum would get charged 65% in those fixed costs as well.
Correct. And there's other ways to do it, but I definitely think just charging it by the acre is probably not going to get you where you want to go. And then the more of those fixed costs you can allocate to a given cost, not only is it going to appropriately charge that crop, but it's going to get you down to a more accurate percentage to apply, right? And so between the crops. And so I would encourage farmers to tackle that issue and really look at how they're applying fixed costs to the different crops. And again, probably the one thing that sticks out of my mind, let's just pretend a farm is half sorghum, half cotton, I could see where they're probably charging sorghum far too much on the fixed cost, and again, making the cotton cost of production look a little more favorable than it should, given that, I guess I would call a loose allocation. And so I think tightening that up will really open some eyes. Now, it may tell us some things that we don't want to know.
Yeah.
and that's fine. But I think if you're wanting to be better at what you're doing, you better dig in there and sort some of that out, because
Absolutely.
in these days of high capitalization and tight margins, it'd be easy to wake up one year under certain situations and really be behind the eight ball when you didn't understand what these crops are truly costing to grow.
Well, John, thanks for joining us again. Is there anything else that we haven't covered today on cost tracking and accounting methods that would help growers be better marketers?
Oh, I think we covered it pretty well, and it's a grueling part of the business, and it's hard to pass off to someone else because maybe a spouse or a brother or someone that has a different contribution on the farm, and maybe not understanding some of the day-to-day expenses and things. So you got to get in there yourself. If you're the main operator, and it's not something you can pass off very easily. And maybe it is something you only have time to do in the winter. Competing with hunting season or football games on TV. But what we've seen again is more people are turning out for the seminars we have that cover costs, and more interest. And the ones that are spending the time, you can tell they just have that extra edge of confidence about their operation, and definitely an extra edge of confidence about their marketing.
Well, thanks for joining us, John.
Absolutely. Thank you.
John Miller, Southwest Agribusiness Consulting. Join us again next time on Sorghum Smart Talk Podcast. The next installation on marketing will focus on nuts and bolts, futures, options, hedge to arrive, forward contracting, and how to handle those things in tight markets when commodity markets are very volatile. In the meantime, check us out on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, like us on Facebook, and as always, check us out on our web homes, sorghumcheckoff.com and sorghumgrowers.com. Thanks for joining us.